Appreciate everybody making it in early this morning. Bobby Lentz from Northrop Grumman. I'm, as a track sponsor, we're here to introduce Colonel Rehn, the TRADOC Capability Manager for Cyber, to talk to us about the integration of CEMA into land environment, offensive and defensive cyber operations. Colonel Rehn is a graduate of the Citadel, has the Florida Institute of Technology, as well as the Army War College. He's had a distinguished career in interweaving advanced technologies into a pretty dynamically changing threat environment, and continues to support us in that regard today. I'm told that his staff determines how long meetings are going to be based on the size of the beverage that he walks into the room with. So we brought you a Diet Coke today, 12 ounce, so we got an hour. Hopefully that'll last. So thank you, Colonel Rehn. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. Again, thanks. Okay, thanks. Appreciate it, Bobby. Thanks for introduction. I want to talk a little bit about cyber and where we're going to go inside the unified land domain. I'm not going to get into the weeds, if you want to call it that, kind of give you kind of an overview of where cyber is kind of going. Talk a little bit about portfolio that I manage, as well as get into some of the technology challenge areas that we see from a TCM Cyber standpoint. Those are aligned with the technology problem statements that were published out for TechNet. So the 1 through 4, I'll kind of talk a little bit about those. And then talk a little bit, at some point I want to stop and then open it up to you guys to allow questions and answers. Generally, if I walk on this side of the room, I'm absolutely lying. And if I'm over here, I'm probably giving you some what I think is what's closer to fact. But I do have a tendency to wander. Does anybody got an iPad 2 on them? Anybody got an iPad? You get an iPad and iPad-ish? So here's an interesting fact. That what he's holding in his hand right now, assuming it is an iPad 2, that was the computing power of a supercomputer in 1988. By 1994, it was still in the top 5 of computing power. So think about that, because one of the premises is technology is rapidly changing. And when you get about to where are we going in the future, predicting what we're going to be able to do in the future is rather hard. And for the vendors out here, I think you're starting to see almost things that you're doing in your IRAD and you're actually putting it out into the field almost becomes obsolete by the time you get it to the customer. And so if you're tracking Moore's Law, there's a point where it's starting to become true, but it's absolutely going to become true. And so what that creates a challenge is how do you keep pace with that rapid technology change to be able to stay ahead of your adversary. Now the flip side of that is that when we look across the world as a whole, how many Windows XP boxes are still out there? So although technology changes very rapidly, our acceptance of and use of that technology, depending on where we stand in both culture, world, and funding, does take time for it to actually transition into the world. What does that create? That creates lots of opportunities when I look from the offensive side. But when I look from the defensive side, it also creates lots of risk in that. So I'll go with it. The other thing I want to throw out to you to think about is data. The world's changing, and data itself is becoming a natural resource. So if you think about that, what does that mean? That means that there's going to be probably, I predict at some point, there'll be conflicts purely based on data. And what I mean by that is the harvesting of data, the protecting of data is going to be so critical is that nation states are going to be willing to defend because of a data problem. Okay. Where's the landscape changing to? See, my guys have heard it, and if you've heard me before, I really talk about when cyber domain, there's 3 real challenges that constantly of how you do it. One is the technology change. We kind of talked about that a little bit. Over on the right side, I think everyone's pretty much familiar with Moore's Law. Okay, that is relatively true, and I think there's some predictions roughly about 2020 is when it's really going to exponentially go to where And I believe the last thing I seen was roughly about 2028 is when the computing power is going to be very close to what the human brain is. Big bang of data. So that is both big data analytics as well as understanding that data is becoming more and more prevalent. You're starting to see a shift inside of jobs from that jobs that are associated around data are becoming more and more. They didn't exist 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but that's where the job market's going. That's where, back to the natural resource about data. Internet of Things, we're seeing an explosion in the Internet of Things. Over on this side, by 2020, 200 billion Internet of Things devices that are connected to Internet of Things. Again, lots of opportunity. If you think about what we can do with technology and how can that help our lives in general versus its opportunity. Again, opportunity from an offensive standpoint, defensive standpoint, lots of risk. How do you manage that? Connect anywhere mobile devices. You're seeing, I think you see that now. What's interesting, if you have not been over to foreign countries, depending on which foreign country, I'll use Africa as an example. I've spent some time on the African continent. Went from basically very, very rudimentary communications, basically me talking to you. In some cases, you'll laugh, but some of the military forces out there actually use drums and knock on and basically take a hollow log and beat on it to be able to pass messages. So that's kind of where they were. HF, they are HF extraordinaires. To where they are now is they've jumped from that all the way up to cell phones. And so their cell phone is, in mobile network, is the equivalent of their NIPRNet for a lot of their military forces. But think about that going from here, what we think is very primitive communications, to very advanced communications. So that barrier of entry is very low, and you're seeing military forces jump from what we would consider archaic up to capability that's pretty unique. Back to the capability, kind of getting in your head, and I believe it was 1992, advanced video graphic software. So how do I do video design and everything? $2 million to get the top-of-the-line software package. That same capability today, I can do for free on Instagram's video editing app. So just kind of, so again, back to that explosion of technology. Machine learning, artificial intelligence, I would say that we're starting to just scratch the surface on that. Being able to take what we can do with the computing power. If you look at IBM Watson and what Watson can do, and there's other technologies that are similar to that, it's pretty phenomenal being able to do what you can do with artificial intelligence. Another factor that goes into it is when you start looking at neural networks, the ability, and when I'm talking about neural networks, it's networks that are designed based off the human nervous system. Why is that important? Well, because at some point that integration of computing technology into the human body as part of your nervous system. That's coming along at some point in the future. The relentless pursuit of technology innovation you have, because of the ease of access to information, the ability for anybody to go out who has desire to garner that information that's pretty much open public out on the internet, the ability to educate yourself, to then also tie in with people who have like interest of you, that don't necessarily have to be with Chief Lucy and I physically together, but he's over in one country, I'm in somewhere else, causes that pursuit of innovation and things that are coming out not from large corporations sending out lots of money in IRAD, although that does happen. But you're seeing that lower barrier of entry of innovative ideas coming from small groups that are out there that are just being able to pull things out. So how do you harness that in the future? Get back to the DoD acquisition system. We're not geared for that type of innovation. We generally are geared towards large companies asking them for assistance to help us in the technology. And so with Futures Command coming out is trying to figure out how do you harness that innovative group that's out there that's not necessarily the large companies, We want them to participate as well as the small innovative companies, but to get those innovative ideas out so we can continue to keep pace with both the technology and our adversaries. In the talent demand, that demand on talent, both from our operators to our technicians, to if you look in the information technology domain, I think we're all familiar with it. If you're a employer trying to find somebody to get in there, it's ruthless out there. If you're trying to get a job, it's great. So it's the demand on the talent, and the good talent will always rise and will always go out there. And then so it's going to be, our school systems and education systems right now are having a hard time keep up with the pace and the demand of the talent. So I think 5 years, 6 years from now, we'll probably see it in a better position. But it's currently right now, that's a huge drain. I won't go through these here. Couple things. If you look at connected cars, what do I mean by that? Connected cars. It's not just connected cars. It's connected to whatever. If I look at robotics, we're going to push robotics on the battlefield. We're going to move more to where the soldier is actually moving to killing, as opposed to the support things that I can automate or I can get other factions inside of there. So again, tremendous opportunities. No longer, if you look at the mule system where I can put all my gear, stick it inside of a rope, basically an autonomous robot behind me, move down the battlefield so I'm not humping a pack. Somebody else is doing it, moving forward. All right, how do I command and control that, and how do I secure that? How do we secure our platforms, our weapon systems? So those, again, challenges, because most of those, when you look at that, old antiquated technology, it's hard to, especially if the vulnerability is in firmware, and that firmware is located somewhere deep in the bowels of the platform. You literally have to disassemble the platform, which is cost-wise. So we got to figure out how to work with those risks on the battlefield. But back to the connected cars, is the technology to allow those connected vehicles basically means I've got processing, and I've more than likely got some kind of transmitter out there. So which creates opportunities, but also creates the risk. I throw this one out there because what we don't realize, most folks don't realize when we talk about big platforms, tank, artillery, whatever you want to talk about. And if you ask some of the major vendors who build those things, most of that cost in the challenge is not in the physical aspect of the vehicle or the platform. It's in the software. In the software code behind it, the amount of code that goes into those vehicles is rather extensive. Some of it is developed specifically for that vehicle or that platform. Some of it's reused. And then how do you ensure that the reused code doesn't have a vulnerability inside of it and doesn't create problems? But what that code does, if you think about it, 111 billion lines of code. For those of you that like to do exploitation, how many opportunities of that is you to find a vulnerability in that line of code? So I just throw those out there for you. Okay, so that's kind of the scenario what's happening in the battle or in the space itself. That's the technology side. Now the other thing that changes is the threat. So the threat is changing, and what we're seeing particularly, we talked about it, or Joe Martin talked about it a little bit yesterday, where our adversaries have been watching us through the sustained conflict, seeing how we operate, seeing what works for us, and realizing where we are. And then they're adapting because they realize they can't face head-on-head. So how do they get an asymmetric advantage? From a cyber aspect, previously it was all about getting into the system and exploiting the system, looking for system vulnerabilities. You're starting to see a shift on that as those operating systems are becoming more hardened. We're actually doing better on our defense. Not just we collectively, but not we DoD, but we collectively in general. The focus is now, how do I exploit the operator or the human? So you're seeing that shift inside of there. What I mean, phishing emails are not necessarily looking at exploiting vulnerabilities, although that is the path. The main route is I got to exploit the human in order to do something. We talked about the second bullet. Again, the adversaries that we see are not going to hit our strengths. They're going to avoid those. So where are the seams? Do we know where those seams are? We have to be able to understand those, particularly down in a tactical environment, understanding where those seams are that can be exploited. Both I'll say our peer adversaries are patient. We as Americans are impatient. We like to see things done now and do it immediately. I would say the adversaries we're going to face, in particular in cyber, are very patient and will take the time to observe and take the time for long-term gains. Where we have we want to see short-term gains. We'll sacrifice the long game for the short term. Utilize for national objectives. I think, in public, you see China, intellectual property. Iran is also taking intellectual property. If you're ever interested, go over to the Department of Justice. Look at the indictments that are being issued out. So when you have a whole of government attack against, or a whole of government effort to thwart cybersecurity. In the spring, there was an indictment. I think you guys have seen the news about the Russian indictment. I won't go into that one there, but there was another one about the Iranian group. So there were a bunch of Iranians, and it talks about the exploitation of intellectual property inside of our educational system. The vector, human going phishing attacks against professors, being able to compromise numerous professor email accounts, get in and be able to take all that property. But it's interesting to understand is what's happening is that's back to the national objectives to take what we're investing in intellectual property and then taking that, which now causes our adversaries to advance further along based on what we're paying for research. How do you take cyber and how do you project that influence? Our adversaries are influencing, and I think you guys have seen where you have nation states using cyber methods to project national power or national influence, however you want to categorize it. What's happening as well is that influence is below the threshold for military warfare. So something that we would immediately react to where we see an adversary to come, if suddenly a fleet were to show up on the shores of Florida, launch in, and there'd be Russian Marines or whoever Marines are down there, that would be pretty indicative of what would we kind of all know what the consequences and what we as U.S. would do. Cyberspace, we don't know that because those international norms have not been established yet. It's new territory. How do you deal with that? But down on the tactical level, the integration of cyber capabilities into the full spectrum military ops. General Martin made the comment is that, hey, I want to send an email to the commander and say that your wife's cheating on you. But that's getting to where we want to be able to integrate cyberspace operations with our kinetic operations is getting to multi-domain operations. Being able to do timing and tempo inside of cyberspace, corresponding with the objectives I want to do in the kinetic land domain, and being able to synchronize those is where we want to go. I also want to look in cyberspace for indicators. I want to look inside of there is understanding an adversary what his TTP are. Does he typically do a denial of service right before there is a counterattack or a main attack? Do I know if he's targeting certain things, if he's targeting my FATADs or targeting whatever the system is that an indicator of something he's going to do in the physical domain? We haven't bridged that. We haven't started linking the two together to understand what is happening in cyberspace. How does that correspond with physical activity that an adversary is throwing? If you look both inside, if you were to study in the Ukraine and look at what happened in the Ukraine as the Russians went across, the Russians were pretty good at being able to synchronize and integrate those effects across the battlefield. The timing, to be able to use both electronic warfare attacks, simultaneously exploiting social media, while sending directed email, while doing denial of service attacks, while making maneuver on the ground. That's a fairly complex operation from a higher level, from a command element. But, if you look at really what they were doing, some of them, you could go back to, I'll say, it's not very sophisticated from a cyber standpoint. In other words, I'm not doing any magical high-end cyber exploitation, but I am using the cyber domain to be able to synchronize those effects across the battlefield. So you don't have to be super complex. You just got to be good enough, and you got to be able to synchronize. Okay. So that sophistication and the plausible deniability, if an effect, we see it all the time when an effect goes along, is it really this actor or that actor, or how do I know it's them? And not even if you can trace it back to a country, is it the government or is it somebody else acting on behalf of the government? How do I trace that? And then even if it's acting on behalf of the government or someone else, is it Fred or John or who is that? All those go back into the challenges of being able to figure out who attribution on it. But if you can go back to the Department of Justice things, I'll tell you we're pretty dang good at figuring out attribution. If we can name off, for example, in the Russian indictment, if you look at the 12 Russians that were on there, commander of the unit, primary capability developer of the unit, the operators. It's pretty detailed information. So kind of, we've got the ability to do it, but then do our adversaries have the same to do it against us? Next slide. Nope, I guess, yeah, it's me. Chief, let me down. Okay, I got the national security strategy up here. So if you're not familiar with it, you got national security strategy, national defense strategy. Both of those are significant shifts in, I'll call it the policy side of the house. So where you start in the national security strategy, you start seeing reflections of the importance of cyberspace from a national security aspect. And you can read through these, but basically what it starts to do for the first time for the United States is saying cyber is important, and we're willing to take actions to defend ourselves in cyberspace. And we're going to build capabilities within inside of it. So that gets reflected down into the national defense strategy. And what it really takes out there is acknowledge that you've got a global presence in cyberspace. I would also act at not only the global presence, but it's 24/7, 365 engagement against multiple targets simultaneously. Different than the land domain, where generally in the land domain, I kind of have one major adversary, if you will. Yeah, there's a bunch of little riffraff that kind of go around in what we've seen in conflict before, but generally they're all kind of in that same aspect, and I can kind of understand what that battle space is. But not every single thing that I have is being engaged 24/7. Interesting fact, MedCom, Medical Command. Is MedCom a terrain owner? We don't think of MedCom as a terrain owner in the kinetic space. In the cyber domain, they are absolutely a terrain owner. The way the commander should be thinking about, whether it's MedCom or I'll call it one of our support commands, how he should be thinking about the battlefield now is totally different. And that battlefield is cyberspace. His S2, or really, they don't really have an S2, his security officer, physical security, and, gate guards, personal security. We're not thinking about what are the key terrain for the MedCom guys. I'm just using them as an example. What's the critical asset? What adversary would want to get into there? Do the IPB against it? What's the key nodes? Where are my critical assets? How do I defend that? How do I then identify that and then inform the commander that, hey, somebody is trying to do something to attack you. What are you doing? How are you adjusting our defense? He doesn't have any assets to adjust his defense in reality. But that's what we've got to be able to think about is how do you change that? International norms, I talked about that. Is that's still internationally trying to figure out where, what is an act of war, what's not an act of war. I think it's probably too strong of a statement because, again, generally U.S. policy is we'll tell you what an act of war is when we see it and we decide what it is. Attribution is difficult. We talked about low barrier of entry, but that bottom one is a significant change for the United States. We saw it at 9/11, but in cyberspace, it's there every day. The homeland itself is no longer a sanctuary. So the tyranny of distance with the two big blue water we have on both East Coast and West Coast no longer are a factor for cyberspace. Not only that, but that low barrier of entry. A good group of individuals could have massive effects against the United States that normally would be reserved for that a normal nation state would have done in the past. Cyberspace, it's changed that game. Okay. Almost made you change it again, Chief. Yeah, sure. There you go. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about portfolio. So first off, raise your hands, don't be bashful. How many actually know what a TRADOC Capability Manager is? Okay, I got like 10%. Don't feel bad. I was in the group with my hands down when I got into the job. In short, we're the user representative. So whether it's for me, for cyberspace, it's TICM, Ariel, TICM, Lyft, or whatever it is, we're the user representative. What does that mean? We go out to understand what the users need. In my case, primary portfolio is inside the Cyber Protection Brigade and the 780th, our cyber. What do they use? Understand how they operate, understand their needs for capabilities, take those, now becomes the hard, boring part, which is then put those into requirements, and then try to understand what the requirements are, document them, get them through the Pentagon, get them approved. Look to my friend over for resourcing and try to get it resourced. Once it's resourced, then make sure it gets assigned to a program manager or somebody to actually build the capability, hold them accountable, and then start the cycle all over. So that's kind of in general. The portfolio that we have, my portfolio itself is inside of, from your left to the right, Defensive Cyberspace Operations. That is the Cyber Protection Brigade primarily. I say primarily because there are some things that bleed over. Offensive Cyberspace Operations. And then I'm going to go over to the far left, your far right, which is Cyber Situation Understanding for Army and support. Cyber Situation Understanding and support of CEMA. That is not for cyber guys. My primary customer, my primary user on there is the tactical force. So this is where really when you want to get to multi-domain operations and operations inside the supporting the unified land ops, how does a commander understand what's happening in cyberspace if he or she cannot visualize and understand it? So right now we have a tendency to take cyber in our tactical formations and stick it on the 6 and say, make magic happen. Okay? I will tell you the 6 does not, if I look across the spectrum of cyber, and so let's take, what you can't see up here is the blue network aspect. How many 6s do I got in here? How many folks have been 6s? Of the networks that you operated inside whatever formation you are, or that I'm going to rephrase it. Of the networks that existed inside your formation, how many of them did you have true visibility over? So I'll throw one out. PAO, did that run through you? You guys operate that one? Logistic network? Medical. Where I'm going at is that we tend to think of the command network. I'll call it our command network, WinT, whatever you want to call it. That is the primary thing. But when you really pull back and you look at the number of networks inside of a BCT, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's at least 7 different networks that are out there. The 6 generally has a good hand on called the primary one, but all these other ones we don't have. As an adversary, which one do I really want to probably go into? It's probably not this one. I want to get there eventually, but the weaker ones are the other ones. How does the commander get visibility of that? That's what we're trying to do with Cyber SU, is not be necessarily the sensor, but be able to pull the data for those. Because the data about that network exists somewhere. How do I take that? How do I correlate it? And how do I present it to commander? Not only that, but when we talk about indications and warning in the battlefield, I got an adversary who's throwing EW, and let me back up for a second. You have a link go down, one of my former F6s. What's your immediate reaction drill? Start doing my troubleshooting. Oh my God, link went down. Commander's throwing coffee cups at me. And so now what ends up happening is we generally go right into troubleshooting, and the immediate response generally is, okay, something's wrong with that piece of equipment. Start doing fault tolerance on the equipment. But what if I were to tell you now that the link went down, and at the same time I got indications from the electronic warfare, EWPMT, that's feeding in this, that says, you know what? There was RF interference over inside of that same location, same time. Would that change the way you do your reaction drill? I would say it absolutely does. But now it's from the commander side of the house, is now that link's down, the mission thread of being able to, let's say the call for fires went across that particular link. Do you have a backup link? Did that totally take out your ability to do call for fire? Or did it just degrade it slightly? Do we have a good ability to represent that to the commander today? And what is that? So now, not only what the link is, what happened, what's the impact on my mission? To be able then to present that to the commander and say, boss, this is what's happening in cyberspace. Oh, by the way, I'm going to throw a little intel on that. And at the same time tell you that events that we just seen in cyberspace, because there was also a DDoS attack that was happening that we're able to detect as well simultaneously, that is typical in the doctrinal template for the adversary we're facing as an indicator that he's about to launch an attack, probably because of where the location was in this particular AOR. And we may not have seen any indications in the physical domain. So that's where we're trying to get to. It's hard. There's lots to it. Now, when I look at cyberspace, so when you look across this and looking across that spectrum, what else is in there? Okay, so we've got the ability to kind of know where the network is in general. I got the IP side. Do we know what the RF spectrum looks like? And how do I overlay it on top of that? And then I take, again, Intel, overlay that, take the mission side of the house, and put that on there. Are you guys familiar with the term cyber electromagnetic activities? I think everyone kind of is. Working group. Anybody not know what a CEMA working group is? I'll be bashful. Okay. So we all know a CEMA working group really is another fancy name for the staff that has to integrate CEMA. Are you all aware that as well is one of the 4 core competencies and tasks of a staff is to conduct CEMA planning? How many of you know how to do CEMA planning? So this is where we've got to get to. And so that's about to. And so what's inherent is it's not just the responsibility of, I'll call it the nerd in the talk, which is the CEMA guy or the 17 or the 26. That's my loggy guy, pick whatever functional area you want, has to understand that they are part, and we all are part of cyberspace now, whether we like it or not. How does that affect what we do, and how do we take that to the next step on the battlefield? Okay, this middle one, persistent cyber training environment. So this is a capability not just for the Army. The Army was designated as the primary acquisition authority for that. Inherent, along with that, assumed responsibility, and I'll say assumed responsibility, because the Army's doing that, we're generating and acting as the user representative for that. What is that thing? That is the ability for our cyber forces to train inside of cyberspace. Realistic training, all the way from the individual side, all the way through collective training, be able to get to force-level training. Force-level training is think of 2 or more teams operating together, to full-blown mission rehearsal in as best of an accurate replication environment that they're going to be operating in. I'll say also not the current focus is cyber mission force. Eventually it's going to get down to, I'll call it forces operating in cyberspace. What do I mean by that? Now, 6s. Eventually, we want to get you a place where you guys can actually train your forces, have the ability to be able to train on the network, your replicative network, without actually setting it up, going out in the field. I'll tell you, that's going to be some time away because, again, this is limited by funding, and the funding right now has been focused on the cyber mission force. But that vision end state will come. I'll be honest with you, I'm not going to see it in my time in uniform, although Dave's laughing at me because my time in uniform is pretty short. But the reality is that they're trying to get extended down to the other cyber operation forces. Could it happen? Yes, but it's not going to happen probably in the next 3 or 4 years. The focus right now, the heavy, is getting on the cyber mission force. Okay. On the DCO side of the house, for both the DCO and the offensive side of the house, what else? I won't get into the details behind it, but in general, what we're trying to do is we're trying to build out capabilities for the Army to eventually go that could potentially be used by the Joint Force. We looked at it from a standpoint of stepping back and not just doing a point capability. How do I build a capability for the force that is scalable, flexible, to cover both the cyber mission force and at the time we were starting to do the requirements, but also acknowledging there's going to be some force inside the tactical environment. So how do I build those capabilities to be able to support those? Have to be mutually supportive. Can't have a set of capabilities specifically for the tactical environment that cannot integrate with or operate with the stuff that we use for the cyber mission force and the operational strategic force. So that was the approach we took on there. The second approach is it's got to be scalable, flexible. So I've got capability, and if you were to blow this up, over on this side, this kind of confuses folks on the far left side, is we drew a striker. I think there's I think it's a 50 cal, a FLIR device, and CPOF, whatever the mission command system is. The intent behind it is if I could talk to infantry guys and say, look, here's the reality is inside cyberspace, or excuse me, inside the kinetic domain, you got a vehicle you move around the battlefield from. That's how you maneuver, and that's how you move forces around the battlefield. You have something to kill things, something to find it, and you got to do command and control. So these lines kind of line up with that from a capability standpoint and uses that same kind of concept. So I've got kit that I can deploy, small kit, DDS, a deployable DCO system. I've got large kit that we put inside the general enterprise network. Okay, it's a Garrison DCO platform. And I got kit that's going inside the tactical formations, the tactical DCO infrastructure. Currently right now it is separate stacks. Eventually as TSI V2 comes out, it's going to be integrated as part of that. Why? Because we realize we're starting to put stacks out inside a formation at the same time we're trying to pull servers out. That's pretty stupid. Let's integrate it together. So it's one kit as opposed to multiple kits. And then everything above this, that's all software. Software we can rapidly change and go through and upgrade to the best of breed based on what my friends at our cyber are telling me, hey, this is good and this is not, and this is what we need to be able to keep pace, plus industry bringing out some of the best and brightest software and capabilities out there. The ability to maintain pace and outpace the adversary. Similar structure inside the OCO side, and I'm not going to go into others, say it's OCO and it's there. Chief, hit me next slide. What are the challenges where are some of the areas that, from a technology standpoint, do we see challenges at? And I can apply those across pretty much all four of those general areas. Artificial intelligence. How do we keep the capability of being able to do artificial intelligence and then use it for planning and execution, reduce it in the time that I have to configure things? In other words, take the burden off the operator. Push that artificial intelligence out to make the operator's job a lot easier as opposed to give them options to make a decision as opposed to creating the courses of action that end up either gathering information or creating courses of action. That's really how I would sum it up. The last bullet on here, the close the gap between the technology and the operator, that one's personal to me because I got burned by a very high technology network, designed and engineered. I was just, you looked at it and you're like, wow, that was really cool. That's awesome. The problem was the operating force to operate that network was not trained at the level required to get the maximum extent of what that was designed for. So kind of challenge out to our vendor community and academia, how do you build that knowing full well that I want that high level of capability, but my operators and education-wise, either for whatever constraints or limitations, just don't operate at that same level. We don't have PhDs operating all of our networks or whatever the technology is. How do I take the artificial intelligence, not to reduce the network down, but to bridge the gap between where my operators' education and skills are up to the performance of the network to maximize that? to take the burden off the operator, to not totally remove it, but take it off to bridge that gap so we can maximize what the true capabilities are of the technology we're trying to use. Cyberspace modeling and simulation gets into how do we start being able to model in sim both the planning of the effects. Very simple, if I were to take a B1 and I were to say, what's the radar cross-section of a B1? We know what that is. It's physical, and just kind of go through. And if I were to take that same B1 and fly it against pick whoever your favorite adversary's enemy air defense system, how can I take that in, and where am I going to be detected? What's the probability of detection, and what's the whole probability of pick whatever it is you want? That's fairly easy because that's kinetic and it's physics. If I push that over into cyberspace, what's my same equivalent of doing that in cyberspace? That's pretty hard. It's extremely hard, and part of the reason it's hard is because it depends on the conditions that I'm talking about. That physical domain, it is what it is. Whether I use it in China or I use it over in Brazil or pick whatever country you want to use it, the physics are fairly general or fairly consistent. Every time in cyber, the configurations and the conditions are always changed for whatever that environment is. Even though the systems may all be the same, the configurations, because of the operators, are different. So it makes that modeling and simulation much harder. But I got to be able to do operations planning, to be able to project to the commander, here are potential effects based on what I know, and how can I relay that? Not only the planning inside of that, if we're trying to defend something, is it better to put this defensive mechanism in this location? Or what if I put it over here with the same configuration? Does that change my posture on the network? How do I model and sim that, and how would I get to that ability to tell the commander? Proficiency training. This really gets over to PCTE, and that's I'll use PCT primarily, but I got to have the high fidelity of that model and sim. And we're inside of that. That what we're trying to look at is three different things. One is network traffic. I need robust network traffic that actually is realistic to the network. Most of the network traffic generators right now are not very robust. I'll tell you that the good defenders are able to spot adversaries in that pretty dang quick. Why? Because it's very generic, and I just look for that one outlier that's up here because there's no noise on the network in that traffic generation. That's generally where, if you want to hide, you hide in the noise. Well, the traffic generation is just pure traffic, but no noise. How do I build that very robust generation of traffic? Not only that, but how do I get traffic that mirrors what my real networks are, as opposed to the standard 5, with our 5 favorite protocols. So I got to get very complexity on that. Also, user interactions on the network. Okay, if I'm trying to train advanced operators, but I got basic user interactions, it's not doing much. It's the difference between paintball versus complex military operations in cyberspace. And so I need to be able to do the advanced user actions on the systems to include system calls and details about the operating system. Not only that, but what's the data, back to data, because data is important. I like to hide in data and do things with data. How do I build that similar capability for simulation of that data? Generally, our operational environments that we do for training in are not very data rich. So how do I find where an adversary has done manipulation in data if I don't have a lot of data? It's pretty easy. There's only 2 things to choose from. They're going this one? Nope. Look in that one? Up there it is, 50-50 chance. That's kind of where we're at today. The predictive modeling, being able to get back to that's more about in the forecasting side of the house. I'm going to skip over down to the advanced analytics, and we're getting pretty good at the predictive analytics of being able to identify the what. I'd challenge and say where we got to get to is the prescriptive analytics, not just the what, but what does the effect of that what mean? And so don't just tell me what it is, but tell me the impact and how do I get to that next step and why is it important for me? So as a commander, the commanders now have the ability to understand the impact and then can take action, as opposed to a history lesson in the past. The lightweight analytics, as we big data, and we like to make big analytics, but in tactical environment, I don't have a lot of compute, and we don't have a lot of transport. So those are precious. So how do I build the analytics in such a lightweight fashion that I can push them down to the tactical formations to be able to do what they need to do without killing the servers and killing the transport behind it? This last part is for my attacker friends. The thing you hate the most is change. So for defending side of the house, how can I change the environment constantly? On a constant change. So not just the network, reconfiguration of IP space, reconfiguration of network routing, all so that I still can conduct operations, but it's very dynamic. But I also want to reconfigure the platform on a constant state. If I can reconfigure that platform and where my memory allocation buffers go on a constant state, but still be knowledge of where that's at, how complex is that for an adversary? Runtime environments. I want to change my software. Can I change my software in such a manner that I still maintain control of it and configuration control of the software, but then also so that where an adversary was looking to a particular exploit area, it's no longer in that, or it has changed or modified from that. To include the data from a data protection side of the house. Gets into being able to do more stealth on a network. I want stealth for both defensive as well as offensive. And I want to be able to do, randomization. I can't. Some chief help me on that one there. That's a big word for me. But I want to be able to do hide in plain sight for the most part. But how do I do that and make it harder for detection of an adversary who's in my network to know I'm actually hunting or finding them? And how do I stay hidden from an adversary on the opposite side? The return to trusted known state, and I'll tell you, since I've been around playing deeply in here since 2000, that's kind of been the buzzword out there. How do I return to known trusted state? But I would argue that we still can't do it in a real-time operating environment while a platform is moving. And where I'm getting at is I said platform. So our platforms, cybersecurity, we talked about a little bit earlier, but those are at risk. How can I build platforms out there acknowledging I got a major cyber threat such that if I understand that my platform might be at risk, I can hit a button and return it to a clean, known, good operating state while on mission without having to go back and having somebody in maintenance redo it for me and maintain contact with the enemy without losing capability of that platform, because it's, remember, a whole lot of lines of code that are driving it. Just like when my tire blows, I got to change the tire on the fly. You got to pull over, change the tire, and keep moving. Bust a track, got to get the track and keep moving. Same thing from the cyber environment. Okay, Chief, next one. All right, so all this is complex. This is kind of my closer slide, but just in general, the pace is extremely fast. Talked about the change in dynamic environment, operations threat, and the technology goes. But how do I get capabilities really out in the field? I will tell you the DCO space is probably what I have seen leading the charge so much that what does concern me is in some cases we're outpacing capability going to the force. And the force is actually having a hard time keeping up with the pace of the technology. If you think about it, putting kit out every 6 months to them, and by the time it takes to train all the soldiers to get to be able to do that kit, and next thing you know, we're dropping a new kit on them. Sometimes we got to watch the pace, and sometimes we might be outpacing them. So we got to be careful with that. That's a good thing in the fact that we're actually getting technology and capabilities out to the field. But this whole model doesn't work unless you have this centerpiece, which is a strong partnership between the capability developer, TICMs, the material developer, the PMs or whoever's building the capability, the operational unit, and I'll even throw in the testers in that, and also throw in whoever our mission partners are, academia or commercial industry. Those, and not only strong partnership, that's not just me and Chet calling each other up once a week. That's living together in the same space, working the same problems simultaneously. That synergy about working together. Now, I'll give you, it could be virtual or it could be physical. From what we've seen so far, though, the physical connectivity is absolutely what's helping us maintain that pace and understanding, because now everybody understands where the problem sets are and how it impacts operations, and is seeing eye to eye what that operation is, and it's making that change occur. What does that give us? Faster delivery of capabilities. Capabilities actually become much more affordable now because we're not wasting time on things that may not be relevant or material. Focused improvements. Give you what you need when you need it, not giving you a lot of fluff up front. Innovation. We're seeing a lot of innovation in that space as well. You can start to manage risk a little easier, but that second to last bullet was really key and essential, is delegation authorities and trust down to the lowest echelon that you're willing to take that. When I'm going to geek out in you on the JSIT side of the house, when requirements are approved for capability drops, in other words, think of it as major feature changes up inside the Pentagon, that doesn't give you the innovation. And it's not necessarily because the Pentagon can't do it. It's a timing factor. By the time it takes longer to get through a scheduling process, to get it even on the calendar, to get someone to look at it, to get it approved, than it does to actually develop the capability, give it in your hand, and tell me it works or doesn't work, and actually execute the operation. So that's the change in dynamics that we're trying to do to be able to get that capability out to the force in the field as fast as we can. One more slide, Chief. All right, with that, I'll shut up and open it up to any questions. Yep.
Go back to your portfolio slide.
Mm-hmm.
In reference to the multi-domain task force pilot that's coming up.
Yep.
A lot of we get the head on that. What do you see TCM Cyber's role as a multi-domain task force?
Yeah, so we get down at, thanks, Sean, for talking that. So when I start looking in, so right now the CMF has been primarily the focus for the Army. We're now shifting down to how do I start doing tactical inside of, or cyber in the tactical space. Several formations that are out there. So you got the multi-domain task force, IQs, intelligence, cyber, electronic warfare, space, signal, whichever one you want to call it, detachment. And you got CWSB, Cyber Warfare Support Battalion. All those formations will have some level of inherent cyber inside of it. Still yet to be determined as far as what that actually looks like. But there will be, the intent is to equip those formations with the ability to do electronic warfare, maximize the intelligence that's inside of it to support those, defensive cyber, and some offensive cyber. Again, what that equates to is still kind of to be determined. We're seeing efforts, that our cyber has expeditionary cyber teams that are out there that have actually gone to NTC several times, have demonstrated capability both in the offense and the defensive side of the house in support of the operation. I think you'll see probably more, again, the focus will probably be more on the DECO side of the house to act augmentation support. What we're also seeing is that we've got a capacity issue. Cyber mission, a lot of stuff to defend, and at one point, if you rewind maybe, I guess probably 4 or 5 years ago, it's kind of like the CPTs and the Cyber Protection Brigade and our cyber was going to defend the universe. Everything, we're going to do everything. The realization is that it's not just their job. They're more like they call it the advanced team, the cavalry, JSOC, whoever you want to call in, the specialized team that goes after the specialized threat. Our responsibility is to inherently defend ourselves. So I say that because that, again, back to slightly different mind shift from where we were 4 years ago to now, and I think we're starting to see that. So back to the DCO capabilities, initially we had projected the TDI was going to be primarily the CPT's tool. Now the reality is it's the 255 Sierra 25 Delta in the BCT that's going to be the primary user of that in direct support of his commander, with a remote capability for the CPTs and or the RCCs to come in and overwatch. So that shifting the economy of the battlefields out there. Capability-wise, again, I think you're going to see capabilities that are not going to be, they'll be technology exquisite. I mean, it'll be great technology stuff. However, it's going to be something that operators, again, you have to look at the formations and where it's at, are not going to have a lot of support behind them. So they got to be something that can be quickly done without a lot of technological assistance that supports the operators to get the job done in the time they need to be able to do it quickly. Did that answer? Okay. Yes, sir. What time we got, Chief? Okay, I got 10 minutes. Correct.
But it's got to be baked into all of them. How are we ensuring whether it's hardening our platform,
Right.
protection wise, or making sure CEMA capabilities are integrated, whole thing, so that echelons and operators have that integrated mindset
Right.
as we develop the future operating concepts, future capabilities. How do you do that?
Yeah, so the first step is I'll start with the network CFT to start with, because that's probably the easiest one. So there's efforts to make sure that cyber is baked inside the network CFT. So my counterpart, the TCM NNS and TCM TR, we're working together to make sure we get that cyber aspect inside of it. When you start getting into the platforms, I'll acknowledge that that's where I think it's more challenging. Is we haven't really come together yet is how do you harden a platform as an army collectively? I'll just flat out tell you that's a challenge. I don't have a good answer for you, other than the fact that first problem is you got to identify the gap. Once you identify the gap, then at that point, how do you fix the gap? And we're just in the identification of the gap right now. So. Any other questions? Okay. Hey, thanks. I appreciate your time. Enjoy the rest of the TechNet. Thanks, Chief.
Are you going to go straight back to Guardian Hall? That's what I was going to do.
I got to look. Let me hit these guys real quick.